Hello everyone. In the present video, I will discuss about the agrarian class structure and class relation in agrarian society of India. How rural sociology understand agrarian society. How rural sociology understand agrarian class structure and class relations. So these issues we will discuss in this video. So first, I will focus on agrarian class structure and then I will focus on agrarian class relations. In order to understand agrarian class structure, we have to discuss various phases of the evolution of agrarian class structure. That is, agrarian class structure evolved over the period of time. So there are many phases of its evolution. Primarily, there is two phases. One is colonial phase, another one is post-independent phase. So I will particularly discuss about the agrarian class structure in the colonial period, and then I will discuss about the agrarian class structure and class relations in the post-independent period. So let's begin. Agrarian class structure, that is agrarian class or agrarian class stratification, which was a very new concept in Indian agrarian society. Why? Because before colonial rule, Indian society or India's rural society was not feudalistic. Indian rural society was mainly based upon subsistence practice, subsistence economy, simple economy. Colonial rule, colonial rule mainly brought the feudalism, feudal social system, feudal economy in Indian agrarian society. And because of this policy of colonial government, the class structure emerged. How they have introduced this feudal economic system? They introduced it through the land ownership systems. Primarily, three land ownership systems they have introduced: Zamindari system, Rayatwari system, and Mahalwari system. These three land ownership systems and their specific features I will discuss in the separate video. Here my point is that how class structure emerged because of the feudalistic economic system, feudal social structure which introduced by British. So class emerged or class stratification emerged because of the British policy of land ownership system or feudalistic system or feudal social structure and economic structure of the India's agrarian society during colonial rule. Now, what were the classes? Whenever we are trying to understand class structure, we must explore the classification and hierarchy. What are the various classes and what is the hierarchy? That is how hierarchy is maintained in this particular society. So basically there were three classes emerged. One was landlord, means zamindar. Second was peasant, and third was agricultural laborer or landless laborer. These three were the primary categorization, and the hierarchy was like that. Zamindars had the domination, occupied top position and powerful position, supreme position in the agrarian society, and then the peasants, and the last one was the landless or agricultural laborers. So this was the primary categorization of the agrarian classes during colonial rule. But we have to analyze this class structure more more detailed way. Who was landlord? Landlord was the class. Landlord was a class which mainly created by the British colonial government for administering a particular place, for maintaining a land affairs, land management, land revenue system, and agricultural activities, commercialized agricultural production and all. So they appointed many individuals as either individual landlord or the collective, the landlord or landowners. So a class emerged because of the British policy or colonial policy of the land ownership system. Now, who was the actual landowner? Landlord was not the actual landowner. Landlord was landlord was given the ownership rights by the colonial government. Actual landowner was peasant. So that is why rural sociologists call them as peasant proprietor. That means they actually owned the land, but their ownership of land was subject to follow the instruction of the landlord. That means even if they had land in their ownership, but they were not allowed to do any cultivation activity. They were not allowed to do their cultivation activity as per their wish. It was the landlord who imposed various various instructions, who imposed various the rules, regulations, and moreover, taxation policy of the landlord, taxation policy of the colonial government was very much exploitative. So even if the peasants who had lands in their hand, in their ownership, but it was mainly under the control of landlord. So peasants were the actual landowner, but they became vulnerable, they became helpless. Again, within peasants, there were the rich landed peasants, then middle class peasants, and the marginal peasants. But their cultivation, their agricultural activities were under the control of landlord. They had to pay huge taxes and dues to the landlord, and their agricultural activities, their agricultural practices were mainly determined by the colonial policy of the agriculture, colonial policy of the production. Then a very important class which emerged during colonial time was tenant. So tenant is a class which is very crucial and significant in the agrarian class structure during colonial time. Who were tenant? Tenant were basically landless. Who were landless? Who had no land in their ownership. So they had to take land on rent from the landlord. So landless tenant were exploited class who were being exploited by landlords because there were different kinds of rules, different kinds of taxation imposed upon tenant. So four kinds of tenancy were prevalent during colonial time. One was cash tenants. That means those tenants who used to take land on rent basis from landlord had to pay cash for its use. For the use of land, they had to pay cash, a certain amount of tax, as cash imposed upon them, and that was again fluctuating in nature, not fixed. So landlord used to change its rate depending on the demand and the demand of their own. The second type of tenancy was share cash. Share cash tenancy. Share cash tenancy means tenants had to pay certain amount of cash and certain amount of crop. That means both cash and crop they had to pay to the landlord. That was again another kind of tenancy, and that again I have already mentioned was fluctuating in nature, not fixed. Third was share crop tenancy. Share crop tenancy means the tenants had to pay a share of crop after harvesting from their cultivation, from their production, and share was not fixed. Every time the landlord used to change the share, that is share amount. So ultimately the tenants were somehow striving and surviving their life. They were not in a advantageous position, they were vulnerable, and it was up to the landlord how they impose rules, instructions, tax and various other administrative policies. Fourth type of tenancy was croppers. Croppers were mainly those tenants whose only work was to do agricultural production, but their agricultural production, agricultural activities were under the surveillance of the landlord or the agent of the landlord. They had no liberty in cultivation. So their main work was to cultivate in the land, and the landlords or the agents of landlords had the surveillance over them. So they had no liberty, no freedom in choosing crops or agricultural practices, agricultural activities, or they had no control over the crops which they produced. It was mainly decided by the landlord what share they shall get. So ultimately these four types of tenancy were not at all beneficial for the tenants, because tenants were landless, and for survival, for livelihood, they had to do such agricultural activities. So this agrarian class structure developed these kinds of classes in the agrarian society, and hierarchy was very exploitative in nature, because landlord not just a class, landlord was a dominating superior administrative, economic, political class, because they were appointed as a political administrator, as a economic class, as a feudal leader in the agrarian society by the British. And the peasant proprietors were simply the cultivators, but again they were also under the suppression of the landlord due to heavy taxes, because their land was also under the control of landlord. They had no liberty in usage of land, and tenants were completely landless. And again another class which was there within the landless category was landless laborer. This landless laborer were basically the wage laborer or hired laborers. These hired laborers used to be engaged in the agricultural activities or cultivation activities of the tenants or the peasant proprietor. So in this way we can understand the agrarian class structure of the colonial period in Indian society. Then we will discuss about the agrarian class relations. So what is agrarian class relation here? Agrarian class relation means the relationship among the agrarian classes. Whether this relationship was reciprocal, whether relationship was exploitative. So what would be our answer? The relationship was exploitative in nature. It was not reciprocal. Relationship was not for maintaining a professional division of labor. This agrarian class relation was mainly a relationship between exploiter and exploited, oppressor and oppressed. Who were oppressor? Who were exploiter? The landlord were exploiter. They were oppressor. And who were exploited or oppressed? The peasant proprietor or the tenants, agricultural laborers were the exploited, and they were suppressed or oppressed class. So it was not a professional division of labor. Professional division of labor mainly promotes the interdependence, but it was a kind of exploitation of certain classes by a dominant landlord class. So agrarian class relation in the colonial time was exploitative in nature, suppressive in nature. It was not reciprocal. It was not professional division of labor. And in short, we can say the agrarian class relation was feudalistic. It means that there was no professional formal rules, regulations which guided the class, which guided the class organizations or class structure. Rather, it was the rules, customs, traditions of the landlord that guided the society, that regulated the society. So this feudalistic class relation was exploitative, was suppressive for the peasant, agricultural laborers and tenants in the Indian society. So in next video, I will discuss about the agrarian class structure and class relation in the post-independent India. And then I will also discuss about the three land ownership systems and their specific features. So this much is the present video. Thank you very much for watching.